Hey, what's up guys? Welcome to my complete and detailed Chasca guide. Chasca is the newest 5-star Anemo main DPS character released in version 5.2, and today we're going to cover everything you need to know about Chasca. We're going to talk about her best builds, teams, weapons, artifacts, constellations, playstyle, and more, as well as including a full C0 showcase of her in action. Before we begin, I want you guys to know that I do stream most nights on Twitch, link in the description if you're interested, and with that being said, let's get right into it. Alright, so starting things off, what does Chasca actually do, and how should you play her? Well, firstly, I want to mention that Chasca is a character who has a very unique playstyle, very unique abilities, and so I'm going to try to simplify it and explain it in the most straightforward way possible. Firstly, Chasca's elemental skill is the main part of her kit. When you press it, Chasca will float up in the air, riding her giant gun, and enter a Night Soul's blessing state. She'll gain a Night Soul bar with 80 Night Soul points that will drain passively, and throughout its duration, you will remain in this Night Soul state, floating in midair, having increased movement speed and a bit of interruption resistance. Inside of Chasca's skill, she has unique new attacks. She'll have a new Anemo infused normal attack, and more importantly, a charge attack where she'll start aiming, loading up 6 Shadow Hunt shells, which will start as an Anemo, but you can actually very easily infuse some of them with specific elements based on what's in your party, which you should be doing. In fact, you should always hold your skill, don't tap it, and enter your aiming mode, which will deal damage that is considered charge attack damage, and this will be the main source of your Chasca's damage and what you're usually playing around. Now, while as I mentioned, for each Pyro, Hydro, Cryo, or Electro character in your party, so elements that can be swirled, your 4th, 5th, and 6th shell will undergo elemental conversion based on the elemental types of your party members. What this means in practice is that if you're running 1 Pyro, 1 Hydro, and 1 Cryo character, for example, your last 3 bullets, instead of being an Anemo, well, one of them will be Pyro, one of them will be Hydro, and one of them will be Cryo. Now, this can also work for multiple of the same element. For example, if you're running 2 Pyro and 1 Hydro character, you'll get 2 Pyro bullets and 1 Hydro one. Now, not only is it nice to infuse your bullets with these elements to deal elemental damage of that type, enabling you to trigger some reactions like, for example, Vaporize with Pyro and Hydro, but also and especially these infused shells called Shining Shadow Hunt shells deal significantly more damage than the uninfused Anemo ones. In fact, if you just look at her talent scaling at level 9, she'll go from having an 83% scaling per shell to a 283% one, which is just way stronger. For those reasons, the way you build your Chasca team really will matter, and you typically want to be building as many support characters of these 4 elements as you possibly can, with 1 or 2 exceptions, but more on that in the team section later. Also, your shells are shot from the last one to the first one in a last in, first out order, just in case you're wondering, meaning you shoot your 6th shell first and your 1st shell last. Now, outside of just that though, you should also know that you can infuse another shell, your 3rd one, through Chasca's 1st Ascension passive. What this passive does is it will infuse your 3rd Shadow Hunt shell to a random type that you have in your party, having a 33.3, 66.7, or 100% chance to do so based on how many different eligible elemental types are in your party. What this means is that in this case, for your 1st passive, instead of trying to have multiple different characters that are either Pyro, Hydro, Electro, or Cryo, the criteria is instead how many different elements you have, meaning that while for your 4th, 5th, and 6th bullet, you could make them all Pyro with 3 Pyro characters, for your 3rd bullet, the one you get through this passive, here you would only have a 33% chance to convert it to Pyro, even if you have 3 Pyro party members. The reason for this is because you are looking for different elements, meaning that in order to get the 100% chance to trigger this effect to convert the bullet, you would want to have 3 different elements of either Pyro, Hydro, Cryo, or Electro, and not multiple of the same one. If you were to have 2 Pyro and 1 Hydro character, for example, then you would just have a 66% chance of this 3rd bullet converting from Anemo to either Pyro or Hydro. Outside of just that, through this passive, Chasca also gains damage bonus to all of her elemental infused shells, based once again on how many different eligible elemental types there are. So once again, if you're running 3 different elements of either Pyro, Hydro, Cryo, or Electro, Chasca will gain a 65% damage bonus to her converted shells, which is a big deal. If you only have 2 elements, she'll gain a 35% damage bonus, and if you only have 1, she'll gain a 15% damage bonus. Next up, for Chasca's elemental burst, she will start by dealing an AoE hit of Anemo damage and firing 6 Anemo Soul Seeker shells that can be converted to either Pyro, Hydro, Cryo, or Electro once again, 2 shells per party member of that element, meaning that it's not about how many different elements you have, but how many different party members you do of those swirlable elements. This means that, for example, even if you have 3 Pyro characters in your party, you will get 6 Pyro shells, converting all of them. Your burst is an ability that has a pretty solid scaling because it hits so many times, and each shell does do quite a bit of damage, meaning that it's an ability you shouldn't neglect. With that in mind, Chasca and her teams may not be able to generate that much energy for her to get her burst back off cooldown, so it's okay if you have to use it every other rotation, but you should definitely just use it whenever you have it, as it does do a lot of damage. For Chasca's second passive, Chasca will fire a burning Shadow Hunt shot at nearby opponents whenever a Night Soul burst is triggered. And once again, if your party has any Pyro, Hydro, Cryo, or Electro characters, this burning shot will be converted to deal elemental damage of one of those types instead. Regarding Chasca's talent priority, you definitely want to maximize your skill, as while your damage, as I said, is considered charge attack damage, its scaling is increased the more you level your elemental skill and not your normal attack talent. So level your skill as much as you can, and then also level your burst. It's important, don't neglect it, and you can, for the most part, ignore your normal attacks, as leveling it up doesn't do anything. Before moving on, I also wanted to point out that Chasca is a character who can explore quite efficiently, especially in Natlan. She has passives that help with that, allowing her to ride around on her gun, consuming phlogiston, and making exploration that much more fun if it's something you care about. It's not the central part of this guide, but I thought I should mention it. Alright, now with that out of the way, let's talk about some more advanced playstyle information, tips I can give you, as well as my initial thoughts on this character. So firstly, as far as gameplay goes, it's pretty straightforward. While Chasca has a very unique design, a unique kit and set of teams that you're going to be running, typically the way you play her is by just using all your support characters' abilities first, then swapping into her, using her skill, and then spamming your charge attacks. You can literally hold down your charge attack, never let go of it, and it will automatically load in the bullets and fire them off without you having to do anything else. You can move around inside of your skill while you are aiming, which is really nice. You move relatively fast so you can kite enemies while also having a pretty long range, although you're typically confined to Bennett's circle. Each of Chasca's bullets will lock onto one specific enemy, kind of based on what you're looking at, which makes it a mostly single target ability. It does allow for some flexibility in the sense that you can choose to focus one enemy over another one, or fire off your bullets early if you notice an enemy's at low HP. As far as the rotation goes, obviously, outside of just using your support characters first, you can fit 4 fully loaded charge attacks in one rotation, and then end it with an elemental burst before swapping out. You will typically have your burst once every other rotation, using it when available, but making sure to use it after your skill in order to 1. Not eat at your skill's uptime, and 2. Gain the 40% crit rate buff that the Obsidian Codex is giving you after consuming a Night Soul point, so after your skill, to make sure you're getting the crit rate buff if you're using this set. I also wanted to point out that while it's not a big deal, Chasca's kit does have some RNG in it in terms of which bullets are infused with what and what reactions you're triggering. It's not that big of a deal. Typically, you're just having a sort of reaction soup, chucking a bunch of elements, and they'll react with one another and it'll do pretty good damage, but exactly how much you'll do from one rotation to another can vary because of that and what you're fighting. Overall, as far as my impressions on Chasca go, I will say that she's a character with some very clear strengths and weaknesses. Her mobility, unique kit, and high single target damage are all very nice and can make her appealing. On the flip side, it is worth understanding and pointing out that she is a character designed towards single target content in particular, as while she can perform fine against multiple enemies like 2 or more, it is worth noting that her damage will effectively be reduced in multi-target situations. This is because while her burst has some AoE, her bullets don't have a lot of it and end up locking on to one specific enemy each, which makes it to where if you're fighting one enemy, all of your damage will go to them, but if you're fighting 2, it's typically split between them. This is kind of the opposite of someone like Molani, whose Shark will mark up to 3 enemies and then hit all of them at once, whereas Chasca's bullets will be split among each of the enemies. In practice, this is something you can work around running Chasca against bosses or the single target half of the Abyss. It's fine, but it's something you need to know that Chasca is mostly a single target oriented carry. She is a character who also really does want Bennett and Farina in almost all of her meta teams, and while there's some without either Farina or Bennett that I'll cover in this video as well, do note that they will perform worse because these characters are both really efficient at buffing all of Chasca's damage, which is multi-elemental, meaning with other characters, it's kind of hard to buff everything, on top of the fact that they're both characters of a desirable element, being Pyro and Hydro. Additionally, Chasca is someone who does have really good room for vertical investment, with her signature weapon, as well as her first 2 constellations being really big DPS increases, if that's something that you care about. While this guide is still centered around a C0 Chasca primarily, it is important to understand that those are things that will greatly affect her performance. Overall though, even at C0, I think she's a pretty solid DPS. She shines mostly in single target situations. You need to understand that it's not that she can't hit multiple enemies, she can, but her damage will be split amongst them versus doing all of it to one single enemy. While I do wish she had a bit more team flexibility, at least in the Farina Bennett slots, who knows, maybe she'll synergize with future Natlan 5-star characters that may help in that regard as well, but it's too early to tell. I also want to point out that while I talked about her mobility, sometimes you can actually just float above enemies' attacks, dodging almost everything, which can be extremely convenient. Again, she's not going to break your game, don't feel forced to get her, but she's definitely strong enough if you like her to get her, put her in a strong team, playing around her strengths and weaknesses, and clearing content with relative ease. Alright, now with that out of the way, let's talk about how to actually build your Chasca. Starting things off for the artifact sets you're looking for, it is very straightforward. Firstly, if you're not aware by now, the Obsidian Codex set is an absolutely broken set for any Natlan DPS, or any DPS who can consume Night Soul points. Chasca very obviously fits this criteria, and so she can run the Obsidian Codex set and get the insane effect that it gives you. In fact, running the 4-piece Obsidian Codex will give you 15% damage bonus from the 2-piece effect, and then 40% crit rate from the 4-piece. Both of these buffs have very good uptime and end up being so many stats that it's just straight up your best in slot option. 15% damage bonus and 40 crit rate is a lot. For reference, a circlet only gives you 31 crit rate, so getting 40% for free from a set just by consuming a Night Soul point, which you'll be doing anyways, is really big and makes this set your undisputed best in slot. For those reasons, I do recommend farming it, although I want to mention that there can be alternatives, like notably the Maréchaussée Hunter set if you're running Chasca with Furina. Now, as we'll see in the team section of the video, Chasca does like Furina in a lot of her teams, and if you are running them together, you can run the Maréchaussée Hunter set for 15% charge attack damage bonus and up to 36% crit rate. Now, obviously, 36 is less than 40, and the damage bonus doesn't affect your ult, so it's a bit worse than the Obsidian Codex set. It's still not as good, but it is close enough to where if you haven't farmed for Codex and have a better Maréchaussée Hunter set, maybe pre-farmed for another character, then you can use that instead, and it will be your second best option. For other alternatives, if you're just looking for personal DPS, other sets like Wanderer's Troop, Desert Pavilion, or even Shimanawa's if you're okay losing energy are all fine at increasing your charge attack damage and giving you a bit of other stats, or even mix and matching 2B sets are viable alternatives, but are really not as good as Obsidian Codex or even Maréchaussée Hunter, so they're not generally recommended unless your substats are just way better or you haven't farmed Obsidian yet. Lastly, for the supportive options, you can run sets such as Viridescent Venerer on Chasca, which will help her shred the resistances of enemies to whatever you're swirling. This is a set that can be nice for your team's DPS, but still typically a bit worse. It can be a bit inconsistent to swirl the right elements, but if you can swirl the elements of your off-field sub-DPS characters like Hydro and Pyro if you're running Furina and Xiangling, for example, then it can increase your team's DPS quite a bit, making it a viable set for your Chasca, focusing on your team's damage. On a similar note, the Scroll of the Hero of Cinder City set can also be a way to give your team buffs, elemental damage bonus instead of resistance shred this time, and I recommend it more on Natlan support characters, more so than DPSs, so not as recommended on Chasca, but it can still be viable. Overall though, keep things simple and typically just run the Obsidian Codex set if you have it. The stats you get from it are just really insane. Now for the stats you're looking for on Chasca, here's what you need to know. Firstly, the generic stats you're looking for on all of your pieces are very straightforward. Crit rate, crit damage, and attack percent are all good at increasing your damage, making you crit more often and crit harder. These are substats you should be looking for on every piece, and as far as energy recharge is concerned, it's an okay substat, but it's not recommended to build over your damage stats, as is typical with many main DPSs. This is because while Chasca's burst is good and definitely worth using, it does a lot of damage, generally if you're running her as the solo anemo character in your team, which you generally will be doing, you would need to build a decent amount of energy recharge to get her burst back every single rotation off cooldown, which isn't worth building for, as you'd sacrifice a lot of damage to do that. So typically for her burst, use it whenever you can, whenever you have it available, but I wouldn't recommend building energy recharge just to use your burst more often at the expense of a lot of crit and attack percent, which would otherwise be more valuable overall. Regarding elemental mastery, this is a stat that can be useful if you are running elements in your team that will allow your Chasca to trigger multiplicative reactions like vaporize or melt, so running Hydro Pyro or Pyro Cryo for example, making elemental mastery a stat that will buff the damage of your elemental hits that trigger those reactions. For those reasons, getting EM substats here and there can be useful in those teams, and a lot of her meta teams, even if you're just running someone like Furina and Bennett, will end up triggering vaporize here and there, making this substat okay. With that in mind, it's still not your top priority because not only is it team dependent, but it can also be somewhat inconsistent and usually isn't as high of a priority as crit rate and crit damage, but it can still be a useful substat to have. With that said, for the main stats you're looking for, you want attack percent on your sands, crit damage or crit rate on your circlet. Both are viable, but keep in mind that usually crit damage will be more recommended generally because Chasca is a character who gets a lot of crit rate naturally by 1, ascending with crit rate, 2, running the Obsidian Codex set, which gives her 40%, and 3, having some crit rate on her artifacts, not to mention maybe even on your weapon. So to help balance your ratio, typically you'll want to go for a crit damage circlet, but if you don't have enough crit rate on your substats, then a crit rate main stat can be perfectly viable as well. Now lastly, for the goblet you're looking for on Chasca, here you typically want to go for an attack percent goblet. This is because, as we saw earlier in the video, Chasca is a character who does damage of different elements. Her bullets get infused with either Pyro, Hydro, Electro, or Cryo, on top of also having some Anemo ones, meaning that because you'll be dealing different damage of different elements, you can't run a damage bonus goblet for every single type of damage you're doing, making attack percent the best at buffing all of your damage. It's the most general option and typically your best in slot, so it's what I recommend for Chasca. Now keep in mind that in in some teams, running an elemental damage bonus goblet of the element that you're infusing your most bullets with, for example, Pyro if you're running a double Pyro team, can be viable if you really don't have an attack goblet. It can be similar in strength, but even then, it's not as recommended as an attack goblet, which is typically better and also just way more universal and more recommended. Typically, an attack percent goblet is the best and most universal option, so it's what I recommend as the best build for Chasca. Alright, now next up, let's talk about the weapons you want on Chasca, covering your best option for every type of player. Firstly, it should come as no surprise that her signature weapon, the Astral Vulture's Crimson Plumage, is her best in slot by a relatively sizable margin. This weapon is a solid stat stick, giving you 66 crit damage and 608 base attack, on top of also getting a ton of stats from the effect. In fact, after you swirl, you'll get 24% attack, and then by running different elements on your party, you will gain 48% charge attack damage and 24% burst damage, basically just making this a great stat stick, increasing every part of your kit. You get crit damage, you get attack, as well as damage bonus for your charge attacks and burst. For those reasons, this is clearly your best in slot option, but don't feel forced to get it, as there are other strong options that you can use. It is worth pointing out though that it can be around a 25 to 30% damage increase from your free-to-play 4-star option, and less than that when compared to your 5 stars, but more on that when we get to the weapon ranking shortly. With that in mind, there are some really strong crit damage stat sticks you may already have that can be not that far behind your signature and just really good overall. Most notably, the Aqua Simulacra and the First Great Magic are two amazing stat sticks. Firstly, the Aqua Simulacra gives you 88 crit damage, which is already just great, and then the effect will give you 20% damage bonus provided you're next to enemies, making it a really solid crit bow overall. Regarding Linny's bow, the First Great Magic, this one ranks very similarly, giving you the same base stats as your signature weapon, while also giving you 16% charge attack damage bonus, which makes it a really solid bow, performing similarly to Aqua Simulacra, both of which being really good stat sticks that you can use if you already have them. Slightly worse than those two options, but still good, is the Thundering Pulse, a solid crit damage stat stick that will give you 20% attack, with the normal attack damage bonus being wasted on Chasca, but outside of that, crit damage and attack still makes it pretty good. For other 5-star weapons, firstly, regarding Amos bow, the attack percent it gives you and the first part of its effect are fine. It can be a viable stat stick, but note that the second part, increasing the damage of your charge shots by their distance traveled, doesn't work with Chasca, and the same can be said with Slingshot, so there is a lack of synergy there. They're not as good as you may think, but Amos bow is still viable. It's just not the best 5-star. Now, regarding the crit rate bows, a few of them can be good because they give you a lot of stats, but note that you get a ton of crit rate for free because Chasca is a character who 1 ascends with crit rate and 2 runs the Obsidian Codex set. For those reasons, you start at a very high amount of crit rate. Like, even without any crit rate on your stats, you already start at over 64% crit rate just from having a fully ascended Chasca on the Obsidian set. For those reasons, when you start running a crit rate bow, while it can definitely still be viable, you have to be much more mindful of, if you can make it work, running less crit rate on your artifacts, building less crit rate to avoid wasting stats and overcapping on crit rate. Now, with that in mind, these bows can still be good. Skyward Harp gives you 22 crit rate, which isn't that much, so you might not overcap, while also giving you a high base attack and 20 crit damage. Polar Star gives you a bit more crit rate, but a pretty solid effect, giving you burst damage and a ton of attack, provided you can trigger its effect reliably, which isn't too hard. You can weave in a normal attack before you use your skill, and stack up your Polar Star to get a lot of free attack. With a weapon like this, even if you're overcapping on crit rate a little bit, it's still a viable and strong option. You just have to be mindful of it and would look more for stats like crit damage and attack, more so than crit rate on your artifacts. Regarding Hunter's Path, this is a bow that is less recommended in my eyes because it gives you more crit rate, over 40, to the point where you already start overcapped, and then the effect scales with your Elemental Mastery, which is not the best stat to build on Chasca, so less recommended and less efficient. Outside of just 5-star options though, Chasca does have quite a few 4-star bows she can choose from. Firstly, for her best free-to-play options, there's mainly two. There's the Song of Stillness and the Chain Breaker. Both of these are really good, but the Song of Stillness, fully refined, is typically a little bit better than the Chain Breaker, giving you a ton of attack and damage bonus on its effect as soon as you get healed. Now, if you're running Farina and a healer in your team, which a lot of Chasca's best teams are running, this is no problem at all, and you can trigger its effect reliably. With that in mind, if you're not running Farina and have no ways to drain your HP, then if you're starting an Abyss Floor, for example, at full HP, you won't be able to make use of this weapon's effect until you take damage and heal it back up, so there can be some inconsistencies there, but for the most part, this weapon is just a good stat stick and becomes really consistent if you're running Farina, which a lot of her teams are running anyways. With that in mind, the Chain Breaker, the new Natlan craftable bow, is a weapon that performs similarly, only like 1 or 2% worse damage-wise, while also having an effect that's more unconditional and easy to trigger, which can make it more recommended if you don't have Farina or want to craft this bow instead. The Chain Breaker also has a high base attack, gives you attack percent, and also even more attack from the effect, and some bonus EM, which is nice. Makes it just another solid stat stick you can run, giving Chasca 2 really good free-to-play bows. With that in mind, to actually mention a third, you can technically run the Hamayumi if you already have it crafted, refined, and leveled, and it can only be a little bit worse than the other free-to-play bows I mentioned. Just keep in mind that managing your energy to get the most out of the Hamayumi's effect can be annoying and a bit inconsistent at times, so just keep that in mind, as you do want to use Chasca's burst generally because it does a lot of damage. Still another viable option though. Outside of that, for your other 4 stars, there are some that can be better, notably with high refinements. Firstly, the new Flower Wreathed Feathers bow is a gacha limited 4-star bow, so you need to pull to get it, but if you have it with high refinements, then it can be better than your other 4-star options and your best in slot 4-star overall. Keep in mind though that this is only true at high refinement, so I'd say R3 or higher, as at R1, while it's still viable and you can definitely still use it, it can be outperformed by your free-to-play options. On a similar note, the Scion of the Blazing Sun Battle Pass weapon is another one that is great. It has a high base attack, gives you a little bit of crit rate, and also increases your charge attack damage, but is a weapon where, once again, if you have it at high refinement, it can outperform your free-to-play options, and at low refine, it can be a bit worse, so keep that in mind when considering which weapon to choose. Similarly, Range Gauge, a weapon that I almost forgot existed, is a gacha limited bow, but one that can work especially with high refinements if your Chasca is getting healed. It can give you a lot of attack and elemental damage bonus, making it a viable and strong option in that regard, once again, especially with high refinements. Outside of that, Viridescent Hunt is technically viable, less recommended, but you can use it, and overall, I think now it's time to condense down everything we just said and show you a more detailed weapon ranking so you can get a general idea as to how each weapon ranks. Keep in mind that the weapon ranking you will see on screen now should be only used as a visual indicator of roughly how good each bow can be, but note that it varies heavily based on many factors like what artifacts and substats you have, party members, enemies you're fighting, rotations you're doing, a lot of different factors, what buffs you have, and so on and so forth can affect how good a bow is, so use this more as a general ranking than an exact one. Still though, as you can see, Chasca's signature weapon is quite good for her, and so are a lot of the 5-star stat sticks, with her also having solid free-to-play options that you shouldn't feel bad to use. Alright, now moving on, let's talk about Chasca's constellations. Firstly, I want to say that Chasca's first 2 constellations, her C1 and C2, are pretty solid increases to her personal damage while also alleviating her team restrictions. In fact, for her first constellation, this one will give her an additional Shining Shadow Hunt shell, converting her second shell to one of the elements in your team, making it deal much more damage. This already makes it a pretty decent damage increase, but on top of just that, it will also increase the chance of you to trigger your first Ascension passive by 33%, being relevant if you're only running 2 or 1 different elements in your team. What this means in practice is that it allows you to run 2 characters of the same, for example, Pyro element, or even 1 character who's not Pyro, Hydro, Electro, or Cryo, like a Shilonen or a Kazuha, as we'll see in the team section, while still guaranteeing that your third bullet is converted to a different element. Keep in mind though that if you already have 3 different elements of either Pyro, Hydro, Electro, or Cryo, then you'll already be at 100% and the second part won't matter. With that in mind, even if you're already at 100% chance without this effect, the first part of this constellation already makes it a decent damage increase to your Chasca, making it pretty strong regardless. On a similar note, Chasca's second constellation is also really good. Firstly, it will give you a free stack of your first Ascension passive, the damage bonus one, meaning that once again, you will get the full damage bonus by only having 2 different elements of either Pyro, Hydro, Electro, or Cryo in your team, no longer needing 3. On top of just that, once per skill press, Chasca will gain a special Shadow Hunt shell that will have a 400% attack scaling, being considered charge attack damage, and also having an AoE. This will be an elementally converted shell that deals good damage more than your average shell, making it a strong amount of extra damage in your rotation. With that in mind, both C1 and C2 can be pretty sizable increases in DPS to Chasca, usually being around a 15 to 25 or sometimes even 30% for your C2 damage increase to your Chasca, depending on how many different elements you have in your party. For those reasons, they're definitely good stopping points if you want to increase your main DPS's damage, but please do understand that they're not needed, in the sense that Chasca is still a good character without them, and you can still build very strong teams around the fact that you need different elements. Next up, Chasca's C3 and 5 increase her talent levels, with C3 being pretty nice because it's her skills talent level, so a lot of damage, and her C4 will buff her burst, giving her some energy, as well as some more AoE elemental damage. It's some more damage, but it's nothing spectacular. And lastly, Chasca C6 seems to be a very strong one, allowing her to instantly fire off shots inside of her skill that will have their crit damage increased by 120%, gaining this state up to once every 3 seconds, with it lasting 3 seconds, so it seems like something that'll have good uptime and give you a lot of damage. A whale constellation, obviously, but seemingly a pretty strong one if it's something something you care about. Lastly, it's worth noting that overall, Chasca, as I mentioned earlier in the video, is a character who has a lot of room for vertical investment if you want to get either multiple copies of her, with her C1 and C2 being great, or even her signature weapon. Now, I want to reiterate that you really don't need any, and she's solid even at C0, so don't feel forced to spend. But if you do want early stopping points like her C1, C2, or signature weapon, they can all be pretty decent. As far as her signature versus Constellations go, personally, as long as you already have a good weapon, I do value the fact that if you are pulling for Chasca, you're also pulling for Ororon, a good support for her and also a pretty solid character overall, which is why I would lean more towards that. But both her weapon and her Constellations are pretty big increases in damage, also depending on like what team options are available to you and what weapons you already have. Alright, now moving on to one of the most important sections, let's talk about Chasca's best teams. Now, as I briefly mentioned earlier in the video, while Chasca's teams can be somewhat easy to build, she really doesn't have the most versatility in the sense that she really has certain units she synergizes really well with that do a lot better than basically any other option. In fact, meta-wise, Chasca's best teams almost always involve Furina and Bennett. Firstly, Furina is just a really solid buffer and sub DPS for Chasca. Not only does Furina have good personal damage, but also through her burst, she will increase all of your teams and all of your Chasca's damage. Because Chasca can do damage of multiple different elements, it's really hard to find a character, a buffer, who can buff every source of her damage, and Furina does just that. Provided you have a healer on your team, healing back the HP you're draining, you will stack up your fanfare stacks, have good personal damage, and also increase your Chasca's and other sub DPS's damage, making her a premier support and buffer for your Chasca. If you have Furina, I highly recommend running her with Chasca, as she really is a part of all of your best teams. Somewhat similarly, Bennett is a really strong buffer as well, giving you a huge amount of attack percent. This will happen through your burst, which can also trigger a strong supportive set you may be running, and Bennett will also act as your healer. This can help stack up your Furina if you're running her, and even just outside of that, having a healer in your team is usually desirable, and Bennett will be the best option for that. Healing you and giving you huge buffs is amazing, and will make your Chasca's damage that much stronger. Oh, and if you're wondering, yes, Bennett's buff does work even when you're in the air. Provided you're inside of his field, Chasca will be buffed. Bennett giving you attack and Furina giving you damage bonus really will elevate your Chasca to dealing way more damage than without them. Now, something else I want to point out is that because Furina and Bennett are Hydro and Pyro, running them together can allow you to get a vaporized reaction or two on either your Pyro or Hydro shots, as well as any other reactions depending on what your last character is in the team. Now, outside of just these two incredible buffers, your last slot will typically be a flex option, as there are quite a lot of different characters that can work here. Before we do that, however, let me reiterate that for Chasca's teams, you want to typically be running characters that are either Pyro, Hydro, Electro, or Cryo. And it's part of the reason why Furina and Bennett are such good characters here, as their elements are desirable in a Chasca team on top of being different from one another. And so because of that, for your last slot here, you typically want to run a character of another one of these swirlable elements, meaning either Electro or Cryo. Among those options include the new 4-star Ororon, who's a really good support for Chasca, as it's a character who just has pretty good personal damage. He gets better with Constellations, giving you a strong buff with his C6, but even just at C0, he's good at dealing damage, synergizing with the Electro Charge reaction that you'll be triggering, on top of also generating a lot of energy, and crucially, being able to run the Natlan support set, the Scroll of the Hero of Cinder City, which is one of the best support sets in the game, and one of the reasons why Ororon can be a good support here. Not only will it increase your Chasca's damage by a lot, but it will also increase his own and any other support you may be running, like Furina. Also, something you should know about Ororon is that he can't taunt enemies through his burst, which is really nice as it can prevent your Chasca from getting hit mid-air. And regarding the hero set, while obviously you can't buff Anemo damage with it, well, that's not a big deal with Chasca because most of her damage comes from her infused bullets, which aren't Anemo damage. Ororon will be able to trigger various reactions depending on the other characters you have in your team, allowing the hero set to buff multiple different elements, buffing not just your other characters and Ororon himself, but also Chasca's infused bullets of those elements, Hydro, Pyro, and Electro, for example, which ends up being a very nice increase to your Chasca's damage. For all those reasons, I suspect Ororon will be a part of Chasca's most popular team and is definitely a very recommendable option given the buffs, damage, and energy that he can give you. Now, outside of just him, there are many other options though. For your last slot, you can run a Cryo character like Shenhe, who will increase your Cryo damage significantly and also a charge attack damage buff when you hold her skill. For defensive utility, you could run Layla instead, who can run a supportive artifact set and give you a comfy shield on top of some damage and a bonus buff with her C4. Oh, and Ziox from the future here, I want to say that Layla, as far as defensive utility goes, did surprise me, especially if you have her C4, because she does give you honestly a decent amount of damage on top of being able to run a supportive artifact set, a supportive weapon, and give you a comfy shield that prevents you from getting interrupted. Now, obviously, it might not be the best offensive option like the other characters I mentioned, still a very comfy one that does give you decent offensive buffs as well, on top of a much appreciated shield. Outside of that, generic sub DPSs could work, although the ones I mentioned so far are my favorite options. With that in mind, I think it's now worth mentioning Xiangling, who can be a really strong character here and can be a part of one of Chasca's best teams, even though she is another pyro character. Now, while Xiangling definitely has her drawbacks, like forcing you to stay in melee range of an enemy for her pyro nado to hit them, on top of already being confined inside of Bennett's circle, which can be annoying for a very mobile character, but even worse if you have a pyro nado forcing you to stay right next to the enemy. But because you're running two pyro characters in this instance, you will lose out on some damage through her Ascension 1 passive, not being able to get all of the buffs that it would otherwise give you if you're running a C0 Chasca. While your last 3 bullets will still be pyro pyro hydro, you will only get a 35% shell damage increase instead of a 65% one, and also only a 66.7% chance to cause your third shell to be converted into pyro or hydro instead of a 100% one if you were running 3 different elements. With that in mind, because Xiangling is such a powerful off-field support and there aren't really that many amazing options right now, she still is a part of one of your best Chasca teams, even despite the fact that you'd be running 2 pyro characters. So keep that in mind. This team is very strong. It's obviously just 3 good characters with Chasca, but note that it will restrict your mobility a bit because you will have a pyro nado spinning around you. And also it has a bit of anti-synergy with your first passive. On a similar note, a strong buffer like Shilonen or Kazuha could also be used in the last slot, but here not only are you losing out from the extra scaling from your A1 passive, you're also losing out on one of your shells being elementally infused. This is because Shilonen and Kazuha are not pyro, hydro, electro, or cryo, meaning that you'll have one shell that will do a lot less damage. Still, they give you a lot of buffs and can be a viable choice, just typically not as recommended unless you have Constellations for your Chasca, notably her C1 and 2, which make her team building a lot less restrictive, allowing you to go for a more generic, just Farina Bennett Shilonen team, for example, which will rapidly become one of, if not her best team, with her first 2 Constellations, with Shilonen and Kazuha being pretty interchangeable here if you're wondering. With that said, for a C0 Chasca, I don't recommend running Shilonen or Kazuha in the last slot compared to running them in another team, due to the amount of damage that your Chasca will lose out on. Even though you're gaining buffs, you typically won't make up for it unless you really don't have better options, in which case they can be viable. Additionally, if you really don't have amazing team options, or just don't have Farina, I did manage to clear multiple times with a Farina list team just running generic good supports alongside my Chasca. It felt better than I expected, but obviously it's not her best team or anything. You just can run viable support options like Fischl or Ororon alongside Bennett, and another good choice with your Chasca if you are lacking Farina. I also want to mention that if you don't have Bennett, as I said earlier, you can kind of just run whatever healer you can use that'll give you some buffs and healing. But I did also want to add that technically a C6 Chevris, even though a lot of her abilities won't work because you're not only running pyro and electro characters, can still give you the buffs of her 6th Constellation that will give you up to a 60% pyro and electro damage bonus, which does add up to be a lot of stats. Obviously, you should still use Bennett if you have him, but if you somehow have a C6 Chevy and no Bennett, she can be a viable choice just for that Constellation. Overall though, while Chasca does have a lot of strong support options, her team usually is anchored towards having Farina and Bennett, 2 premier buffers alongside of her, with a flexible last slot, Ororon being a generalistic and pretty nice option that's also on her banner, but there's also a ton of other good ones that we talked about earlier, like a strong shielder, a strong buffer, or another damage dealer. Oh, and also in case you're wondering about Farazan, don't play her with Chasca because most of her damage is not Anemo damage as we saw earlier, so Farazan's just really not a good choice that you should not be playing here. With that in mind, I'm now going to get into a showcase of my Chasca, a C0 Chasca in action alongside this team in the current Spiral Abyss. Now keep in mind the current blessing is good for Chasca. It gives us 80% attack, which does help her, but I'm running a pretty standard Chasca team on a good build, but obviously a C0 Chasca, level 9, 8 talents, a weapon that's pretty adjacent to her free-to-play option in terms of strength. It's a little bit better, but I do end up overcapping on crit rate, so it'll end up performing about as well as her free-to-play bow on the Obsidian Codex set, and a pretty solid ratio of 101 to 30, with a little bit of ER, a little bit of EM, some attack as well, and overall, just a pretty good Chasca. With that in mind, I hope you enjoyed the guide, and I hope you'll enjoy the showcase. Let's go.
Farewell. Tell me what you see. Take me up. Bullseye. Knock him down. Free.
Time to shine. Everybody stand back.
Time to say hello.
Locked on. Bullseye. Fire in the hole. Teamwork is dreamwork. Let's Bullseye. Locked on. Time to shine. Teamwork is trick.
Tell me what you see.
Bullseye. Locked on. Locked on. Fire in the hole. Strike a pose. Let the world collide. Everybody stand.
Not too far now. Time to say hello.
Bullseye.
Your journey ends here, Lord of Sand. Your sacrifice is ready.
Open fire. Shout it. Off we go. Teamwork is trick.
He's free.
Let my name echo in song. Ha! Bullseye. Locked on.
And so yeah, overall, Chasca's a character who I've been having fun with. I do like that she just rides around on a big gun and does damage that's not just an emo, primarily different elements in fact, which I think is really cool. Personally, I do wish she had more flexible team options outside of just Farina Bennett, but it is what it is. That's my main sort of concern, but if you have a good team for her, she can perform quite nicely, especially in single target content. With that said, I hope you enjoyed the guide. If there's anything you want to add because she is a new character, it will be in a pinned comment, so be sure to check that. Thanks so much for watching, and as always, I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.